if no one knows you exist and you're not doing anything and you're sitting at home being like, why is nobody hiring me to write for their games? Well, there's a reason for that maybe. Like, people need to know that you're even around. People who create, they make it's a habit.
What's going on, everybody? It's Matt Kenyon, and you're listening to Composer Code. Composer Code is the show for video game music makers of all stripes who simply want to make better music. Isn't that what we all want? The best way to learn how to make better music is, of course, to dig down deep into the experiences and the best practices of proven creatives. One of those proven creatives is Kris Maddigan, composer of the wildly successful game Cuphead. Now, what can I say about Cuphead that hasn't already been said countless times across the internet? It's hard. The music is incredible. The art is amazing. I sat down with Kris. We talked about his origins as a musician and a composer, how he steeped himself in the big band era of music Cuphead's aesthetic demanded in order to write the soundtrack. It's like the composer equivalent to a method actor. He's like the Daniel Day-Lewis, but composer version. Anyway, he offers 4 words of timeless advice for new composers, talks about how our habits and our attitudes affect so much of our creative lives. Oh, and he wrote 20 minutes of music total before composing Cuphead. 20 minutes.
I mean, my mom played piano, and she, wanted all of her kids to play something. I think I was the only one that really stuck with it. But so I started on piano, and I hated it, and which I think is also pretty common. But,
just out of curiosity, I kind of want to dive into that. Why did you hate it? Because I also took lessons and hated them too.
Didn't want to play it.
Didn't want to play it. Was it the music, or is it boring, or everything in between?
Everything. That was I think, instruments are finicky. I get when kids want to try things and then they get bored of them, but also, like, I think a good lesson for parents is to, if your kid wants to take drums and you want them to take piano, let them take drums anyways.
Yeah.
Because they might actually want to, like, if you're,
right.
You're not interested in doing something, it's not going to amount to much.
Sure.
So now, everyone and their dog, and myself included, now is like, oh, I wish I played piano better. But I remember that I didn't enjoy it at the time. So
sure.
Like, I practice it now, and I like it, but it's a bit more functional for me now. But,
right.
So I think you have to have the whatever Can anyone really say what attracts them to anything? Everyone is drawn to something, but you don't necessarily know why. So
yeah, that's true. It's a good
point.
I
mean, I liked music, but I didn't want to play piano. And we, I've told the story before, but I'll tell it again. We had, my recollection, we had four tapes in the car. David Bowie, Let's Dance. The Traveling Wilburys.
All right.
A Smurfs album. I don't remember which one. It had Smurf and Beer on it, and something else, which was pretty funky. And then Billy Joel's Greatest Hits.
Oh, that's not bad.
My mom was a big Billy Joel fan, and subsequently I was a big Billy Joel fan. And that was the first major rock concert I saw. It was Billy Joel Stormfront Tour in, I think, 1990. 91 seems a little late, but it was, pardon my language, it's fucking rad.
Yeah.
And but I mean, we had a videotape of Billy Joel live in Leningrad, which is a fantastic concert, which everyone should watch. And he might have been, I think it was one of the first concerts that happened after the wall came down, if I recall.
Wow.
I haven't seen it in years. I should watch it again. But in any case, I was just always drawn to the drums. And watching Liberty DeVito, who was Billy Joel's drummer at the time,
yeah,
he was just having a blast, and he was pounding.
Yep.
And so, I was a kid, and I wanted to be a rock drummer. And so there was a compromise made, and I started taking classical percussion lessons, or basic, snare drum technique kind of things, which I also didn't really love, which is funny because it ended up being the bulk of what I do. But, you know, I still didn't want to focus that much on technique. I wanted to play the drums.
Sure.
So I mean, I reluctantly practiced that to an extent, and I slowly built up. I made like a small drum set of what I had. And then finally, I think when I was 13, I got my first actual drum set.
Nice.
My parents relented. And, you know, I actually wanted to practice. I practiced all the time. So I got good at that and played throughout high school. And also ended up, you know, I played in the concert band in high school and did other, you know, more band or orchestral kind of things. And then took a few years off after high school because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. You know, I did well in high school. I won some band awards, and everyone was like, "Oh, you should go into music." And I was like, "That's a totally idiotic idea. Why would anyone do a music degree? That's like, you know, to me it didn't seem practical at the time.
Right.
Now I realize that people do it because they actually want to do it. But so, you know, I think I took a few years off, and then ended up just by happenstance hearing about the university percussion ensemble was putting on a concert. And I was like, I used to do that. That sounds cool. So I went and checked it out, and I was like, you know, that was the switch kind of went on, and I was like, okay, I'd like, you know, this is actually what I want to do, and I should get back into it. So, you know, I did my undergrad in you know, legit percussion and other various things, and kind of went from there. So that was my background.
Were you composing at all throughout this time, like in your sort of your formative years?
No.
When did you start composing?
I mean, I've written wrote a couple kind of tunes that never really, I think one of them got performed, but it was kind of like I wrote the riffs and then the actual writer of the band wrote the tune proper. I was in a electro funk band in Saskatchewan.
Okay.
It was awesome. We were really the best band ever. But
that's awesome.
So I mean, I had a couple things for there that I had written. I came up with, you know, the drum parts and stuff, but and then really, like, you know, I did a year in the jazz department at the University of Toronto like 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago now, I guess, because I wanted to do my master's, and it was just I had no way that I had that much time to do it, so I ended up only doing 1 year. But I wrote a tune that I did on my recital there, which I still think is a pretty cool tune. It's on my SoundCloud page. And also that same year there was this big multidisciplinary art installation that we did. It was like this all night art festival here called Nuit Blanche, and I think they have them throughout the world. And we had this really weird project in a tent with all these projections and all participants with their brains hooked up to things. And so I wrote some background like, you know, ambient music for that we improvised over. And that's also, I mean, it's all just like processed marimba stuff. It sounds kind of, you know, radically different than anything on Cuphead. But, so, you know, the output of anything I've written could be, you know, just about 20 minutes of music tops before this.
Wow. That's pretty incredible.
All of it excellent, of course, but...
Right. Naturally.
Yes. Yeah.
So I found that so interesting because, you know, all the attention, you know, that the Cuphead's been getting in the soundtrack, it's well deserved in my opinion. Incredible soundtrack. And it's so interesting because I'm sure people see you as a composer first, but it kind of sounds like you see yourself as a percussionist first. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was like, even a lot of my close friends didn't really even know I was working much on this project, or some of them knew I was writing music for a game, but it was never like, we didn't really ever discuss it. So I still think people who know me are kind of like, now they're like, we don't know you at all. Because this wasn't like, I wasn't always telling people like, oh, I'm writing this music for this really cool game. It was just kind of always like I was doing it in my free time. Right. So I don't even think, you know, people who've known me for more than a few years would consider me a composer first either. Like, everyone just knows me as a percussionist or a drummer. So, that is how I see myself. Like, that's the bulk of my formal training, and I see composition as you know, like I've always wanted to write, but I need projects to write for, I think, would be the thing. Like I was never really inspired to write for much before, other than these specific events, right? And this was a specific thing, but I'm not like someone, I think there are actual, you know, like somebody like, not that I would compare myself to Beethoven, but I think he was a guy who like had this deep urge, like he would sit down and just write. And some people have that urge, like they need to create. And you know, you can want to do that, but I without having a proper outlet for it, like I don't know why I would sit down and write big band charts if I didn't have a project, because they're never going to get played. Like, what's the point? So, so this was a really good outlet, I think, for that.
Did you grow up playing video games, and were you inspired at all by video game music as a kid?
I did. I stopped playing games pretty seriously about the time when I went back to university, because I was like, you have to. I sort of had to pick.
Yeah.
And it's
higher education or video games. Yeah.
Well, they're so time consuming, and I'm not someone, you know, at the time I wasn't really a casual gamer. I was playing a lot, mostly RPGs.
Gotcha.
I mean, I've spent a lot of time at Chad and Jared, the developers of Cuphead, you know, on their couch growing up, because we've been friends for a long time. And that was more playing fighting games or Bomberman or Death Tank. We had some party games that we played, but on my own, I played a lot of mostly RPGs and Resident Evils. Those were my favorites.
What was your favorite game growing up? What was your favorite RPG?
I mean, Final Fantasy VI is incredible. It's an incredible experience.
Yep.
Chrono Trigger, like, you know, obvious ones. Lunar, a lot of those working designs games are amazing, and not really many people know them. Because I had a Saturn of all things. And yeah, so there's some more unknown games, but typically, yeah, I just like basic RPG games were kind of what I was into, and certainly I was aware of the music in a lot of them. I mean, particularly obviously the Final Fantasies and anything that Mitsuda wrote. Xenogears I loved as well as Chrono Trigger, like incredible soundtracks.
Yep.
But I didn't really like study them, and for this project either, I didn't. I deliberately didn't really check out much video game music, except for there's a few homages in the Cuphead, which are a couple which are extremely obvious, and a couple which I think are obvious and no one has found yet. But other than that, I didn't really spend much time studying game music, because we weren't trying to write game music, we were trying to write big band music.
Sure.
So I did, the one thing that I did find, like, I did listen to and I found inspiring, and it was interesting going back and listening to it because I hadn't heard it in a long time, were both Final Fantasy 6 and 7, because I think that those are soundtracks that, especially compared, like, a lot of people really like 8. Like, I think 8 is an incredible score, but I think that I don't love the sound of it. Like, it's almost I don't want to say generic. Like, it's not, like, 6 and 7 have really interesting, you can hear a few seconds of either game and know what it's from because of the actual sound samples.
Right.
But also, like, 6 and 7 have themes and leitmotifs that go through the entire thing. And, like Final Fantasy 7, like, when I was re-listening to it and actually just putting it on and listening to it deeply, I was amazed at how many of the tunes are tied together with the same material, which you don't really notice. So, I mean, like, that was an inspiration, and I tried to do that certainly with Cuphead, with the what has, I think, now been dubbed the Inkwell Theme, which makes, the world map theme. It's just the 4-note motif, but it's on all the world maps, it's on the tutorial, it's on a bunch of, kind of like sneaks its way into a bunch of things, and it ties together a bunch of the non-boss themes. I don't necessarily at this point think that I was learning as I was going, but I did work pretty hard on the process of trying to do as good a job as possible. So I don't necessarily not consider myself at this point a composer, but it's just not my primary thing. Like, I think of someone who, like, maybe that word implies something that's more long term, like someone who does this regularly for their living, whereas I'm, maybe a beginning composer would be a better early career startup composer.
Sure. Well, this
is a bit more way to describe where I'm at, but
Well, I would venture to say that your first project out of the gate was a slam dunk. So I think you're on the right track if this is if you're an early composer.
Well, it took. I will say that it took a hell of a long time. I think that's
Sure.
The lesson there is for me is that it's as much as I hate dumb cliches or anything related to sports, 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration kind of thing is kind of how this worked in a lot of ways.
Sure.
Like there was a lot of prep work that was done and a lot of listening and just a lot of studying, how these tunes get written and how you arrange stuff like that. And so, it's kind of just the amount of time you put in. I've done it, since I've been reading a lot in the past year about the creative process and the concept of talent and stuff. And pretty well the universal opinion is that like almost nobody is like, even people who we associate with being these really creative types who like were born like, Mozart and stuff. Like it's pretty well been proven that Mozart wrote garbage for the first big chunk of his life, or his dad wrote it, or, whatever else. Like he was learning.
Yeah.
And, like the only pieces of his that he was writing symphonies when he was 4, but what's the first one of his that gets played? He was, in his late teens or his early 20s or something when
Sure.
the first, the stuff of his which has lasted and still gets played. Like nobody ever plays the early stuff. Like there's still the process there of that he was working at.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. I mean, that's not my point. That's, I've read that now in many books, but it seems to be the general people who create, they make it's a habit. Twyla Tharp has a great. Hers was the first book I read, and it's still I think one of the best. But her book is called The Creative Habit, and that's it's called that because that's what it is. She gets up literally every day at like 5 a.m. and then goes to the dance studio and choreographs and works stuff out. And she's been doing this for 60 years or something, and that's like it's not like everything that these creative types do. Like they don't just like write stuff and then it's perfect and it comes out to fully formed. Like there's a lot of revision. There's probably in a lot of cases a lot of throwing stuff away. At least I think with people who have maybe not a prolific output, but it's all of a high level. Like it's something that they work on every day still.
Right.
And I think that's sort of how I felt with this project too. It's like it didn't come out fully formed the way it is. It took a lot of prep work to get to that point.
I'm super curious when you began composing for Cuphead. I remember you saying it was a pretty long process, several years. Is that right?
And so it came out in September 2017. So it was almost 4 years. Now all that bulk of that was not spent writing, but I think it was from 2013, summer of 2013, for about 2.5 to 3 years. Mm-hmm. That was the process. Every day, 3 to 5 hours a day, getting up and just doing that. Studying. Maybe like there was times when I was busy doing other things. Like it was always a balancing act.
Right.
But it kind of had to be something that I consistently did every day. Like I'm not doing. Right now I'm doing a lot of other like theoretical prep work. Like I'm just going back and doing, harmony work out of books and stuff that I feel I maybe didn't do well at in school. So I'm kind of trying to, I'm studying other things. So if someone asked me if they were like right now, can you do a big band chart? It would take me a few weeks to just get back into it. I'd have to go and re-look at, all of the big band techniques and voicings and everything and sort of re-familiarize myself with them. So if you stop doing it, or in my case anyways, if you stop doing it for a little bit, you have to refresh yourself.
Yeah.
So
I think there's such a lesson there, man, in that it's to have the humility like you did to say, I don't know how to write big band. Like I'm not going to pretend I do. I'm going to go consult those who have gone before me. I'm going to consult the resources. I'm going to go to the source and I'm going to study it and figure it out. And I think when composers can have that humility to say, I don't really know how to write this style track, but I'll work my butt off and I'll study it. and I'll bang my head against my piano until something good comes out by
There's
going,
a lot of that.
Yeah, that's actually, I wanted to ask you, when during this time where you're getting up for 3 to 5 hours, I'm sure every day looked totally different, because you mentioned you have composing, you have study, you're analyzing books. What would you say was like the biggest chunk of that time? Was it listening? Was it transcribing? Was it composing? I'm super curious, like a day in the life of Kris Maddigan writing Cuphead from 2013 to 2017 or whatever. What did that look like for you?
I mean, I think listening was a major part of it. Part of it is just to get, it's tough to come up with ideas. It's when you're writing something in a derivative style, I think it's a big challenge, because you don't want to, like, it needs to have the things that, it needs to have all the conventions that you didn't invent in order to sound like something, like from that specific era. But then it still needs to not sound, necessarily like plagiarized or anything, right?
Sure.
So a lot of it was trying to come up with ideas that were familiar, but not, just direct lifts from something. Which I guess at this point you could get away with, because I think a lot of that stuff is public domain, but it wouldn't be like, it's not cool.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, for me, it's like, if you sit down and listen to an hour of a certain type of music and then go away and do the dishes or something, you might find yourself like humming some sort of tune that's a hybrid of what you've been listening to. And then it's like, write it down, maybe go back and listen to those things and see, like, is this from one of those tunes, or did I actually like make this up myself?
Right.
Like that's kind of like a way a lot of that process worked, was just immersing myself in it and then letting it sort of stew around for a bit, and then seeing what I ended up, and get a melody in my head, and it'd be like, okay, does this sound too familiar, or does this like sound authentic but not a direct quote from something? You want to write like a rock tune, turn on the radio and then go in the other room, and you're gonna hear it. You might hear it and be like, that sounds familiar, but I don't quite know what it is. Yeah. But then you might get ideas that way, or you might, the beat might be turned around. You can't really tell, and it's going to sound totally weird. But there's not many ideas left out there to get that haven't been done.
That's a good point.
So, any help you can give yourself is.
Yeah, I interviewed 8-Bit Music Theory, who, by the way, I'm not sure if you've seen this, but he actually just put out a video analyzing one of the Cuphead songs and kind of dissecting the arrangement of it, and it's really good. Have you heard of that channel?
I saw that video, yeah.
He had a line in an interview that I had with him where he said the difference between plagiarizing a song and writing a good song is that rather than stealing from one song, you're stealing from 6. And that kind of goes back to what you were saying about how when you want to be derivative, there are certain things that are obviously derivative, but when you're making something in the style of something like big band, it's like you kind of have to take some of those cliches that make it that style. It's just
if you don't use those, then you're not writing in that style.
Right, exactly.
Like, that's kind of what it comes down to as well. So how can you balance that? And also, I think people people freak out now about originality. I think the people who actually give a shit about, like, somebody, writing something original or not making something that sounds too much like someone else are people who've never actually had to do that.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Who freak out about it. And it's like, literally nothing original has been done in... maybe hundreds of years, essentially.
Right.
It's just like, it's all about taking what's there and then adding to it or doing something different with it. I think people just need to not be so uptight. Like, it's one thing if you're like literally stealing something, and another thing if, like, rock bands are getting accused of plagiarizing all the time, and it's like, every fucking rock tune sounds the same anyways.
Sure.
To an extent, right? Like,
right.
Yeah, I mean, I love pop music too, but like, there's only so much that can be done in that field as well.
When you sat down to compose, what was your go-to instrument or software or tools that you used to kind of get the ideas out from your head onto paper or in the computer?
I mean, all I really had was the keyboard, which I did pretty well all the writing on. And then I had Sibelius with Garrett and Big Band plugin, and that was it.
Gotcha. So did you find that you would arrange all of the parts on piano, and then once you kind of have them in your mind, you would sort of distribute them to various instruments, or would you kind of have a melody on piano, put it in Sibelius, and then start playing around with different sounds? Because one of the things that is difficult for me to grasp as I'm learning more about music and instrumentation is which timbres of instruments sound good with certain chord tones. Basically saying how to arrange, like one of the things that is most impressive about Cuphead is the fact that you can have this melody that sounds so good on a solo piano, and yet it can also be redistributed to this big band style and really kind of like expand and evolve with dynamics and interest curves and things like that. And I think that arrangement is equally as impressive as the composition. So how did you do that? What was your workflow for figuring all that out and arranging it?
I mean, a lot of it might have just been fluke that it turned out well. But I did have I had a good teacher as well. And he was always able to look at my charts, and, I learned a lot from him, to the point where by the end I was pretty, I had a good idea of what was and what wasn't going to work. But, I think learning the instrument ranges and learning, don't go too high in the bari sax, because it's going to get, uncontrollably, there's not really much you can do up there except it's sort of loud, and
sure.
Like you sort of learn the ranges, and if you want a melody that's too low on the trumpets, then it's literally just going to be too low on the trumpets, and you have to put it somewhere else.
Right.
So you kind of just learn, I think, where everything should go. I don't know if you're necessarily specifically referring to like the solo piano stuff, and then like the ragtime arrangements of those tunes. Is that also what you're implying, or?
Yeah, I'm basically just saying, so you have a melody and you can arrange it for piano, and then it's like, okay, now it's come time to distribute these voices to various instruments. Kind of like deciding what does the bari sax get, what does the trumpet get, and why does that sound good. I imagine that comes from just lots of listening to the source material and identifying, okay, the root typically goes to this instrument, or was it more just kind of trial and error?
There was certainly trial and error and bringing things to my teacher. But also, I was doing a lot of, there's a couple books I really liked were Gary Lindsay's Arranging for Jazz Ensemble, I think it's called. And the Berklee Press book, Arranging, I think also just called Arranging for Large Jazz Ensemble. They're both excellent books, and they kind of lay things out pretty clearly as to like, this works because of this doesn't work because of that. The ragtime ensemble stuff, I'll go back to that anyways. Like, I wrote a lot of those ragtime tunes on piano originally because I was studying a lot of Scott Joplin stuff, and those are very derivative of Joplin.
Right.
But the ones that ended up like Inkwell Isle 1 and 2, Elder Kettle's theme, like those got put into from the piano versions to the large ensemble, and those were literally, I just looked at the Gunther Schuller Scott Joplin Redback book arrangements, and I pretty well used verbatim his instrumentation and the way that he how he distributed the instruments and the voicings and stuff throughout. Those charts, they had those at the University of Toronto as well. And those were very useful to study. And if you can if you can find the recordings of, I think there's a couple of LPs. The one I have, it's the Scott Joplin Redback book, it's called, with the New England Ragtime Conservatory. The instrumentation is pretty well exactly like what I used in Cuphead, because that's where I got that from. I think they're on YouTube. They were kind of hard to find, often, but.
Were there any other resources, books, that were kind of go-to tools for you that I could maybe share with the listeners?
Yes. Let me pull up my list that I mean, aside from whatever scores you can get your hands on, and I read a lot of, not that these were necessarily useful, but there's always something to learn. But I read a lot of biographies, like I read a couple Duke Ellington biographies, and a couple on Scott Joplin.
Yeah.
Benny Goodman, like there's all these. There's a lot of musician biographies, which are just if you're trying to get into the heads of people of that era, it's a good idea.
That's really cool.
I mean, the Mark Levine books are, and specifically if you're looking at specific like writing techniques, the Mark Levine books are good.
Okay.
He's kind of written. It's dense and kind of complex, but like he kind of has written, I think, like the definitive jazz theory book. It sounds like, or jazz harmony. And he also has a really good piano book that I'm working on right now. I studied the Scott Joplin complete works. It's easy to find. You can get it online, but I think New York Public Library assembled it, and it's everything that Joplin wrote except for his opera, I believe.
Okay.
And that's a super useful thing to have. It's like every Scott Joplin piano piece. Gunther Schuller's books, early jazz and the swing era, are also very useful. They All Played Ragtime was a good book by Harriet, Janis, and Rudi Blesh. Maybe a little hard to find, but and then I mean I bought a ton of other Inside the Score. I bought a Fred Sturm arranging book, Henry Mancini, but I didn't really. I mean, I need to actually study them, but I didn't actually ever really delve too deeply into those. But yeah, I mean, so aside from those books, the two that I mentioned before, Arranging for Large Jazz Ensemble, Berklee Press, and Gary Lindsay's Jazz Arranging Techniques, I think those are both excellent books, and they lay it out fairly simply. And also, I don't know if it's still up, but Gary Lindsay has somebody recorded like a masterclass he did, I think at the University of Miami. It's on YouTube, and it's like an hour long, and he just breaks down voicings, all the drop voicings, the chord substitutions and stuff in like the most simple and easy to follow way, and he does it. It's doing it on a chalkboard, and it was on YouTube. Hopefully it's still up, but that's an awesome video, and it really clears things up.
The one thing that struck me as you're saying all these things is that you must be a pretty avid reader, because these are a lot of books, and I can tell that you really dove into the topic. Are you a reader, or were you a reader before Cuphead?
I was, and I still am. I read as much as possible. I don't know. It's a good way to learn things. Going back, this kind of relates to what we were sort of talking about earlier, but I'd like to discuss it. But I mean, like, for me, this project was, I looked at every avenue possible, because I was asked by two of my dear friends to write music for them. And, initially I was like, I tried to do the best job I could because I didn't want to disappoint them. And then once they got, once the game sort of took off a bit more, after that E3 trailer, we were kind of like, oh shit, there's going to be lots of people maybe playing this game. And then it was kind of like, I wanted to do a good job out of respect for the people buying the game, maybe buying the soundtrack. I didn't want to look like an idiot.
Right.
So, there's always a reason to do a bit more research, maybe into the topic. But also, this is a music that I have a lot of respect for.
Right.
And it was super important for me that this did not come across like a parody of any sort.
Sure.
There are a couple goofy quotes, like Ride of the Valkyries is on there. Because it was used in Bugs Bunny.
Sure.
And I don't necessarily think that's parody. I think that's maybe setting it a bit more. I like to think that the reason that it was used in Apocalypse Now is because I'm blanking on his name. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. What's that actor?
Is it Martin Sheen?
No. It's the other guy.
Not Marlon Brando. It's been forever since I've seen that movie.
No, I'm gonna Google this.
I'm gonna Google it too. Let's see if we can who wins. Let's see.
Kilgore is the character.
Yes,
that's who I was thinking. Yeah. In any case, my assumption is or like now, because Cuphead was made in the 1930s, I assume that he's using this in the Vietnam War because he's a Cuphead fan.
Right. Yeah,
You know?
that's a good point. Yep.
But anyway, sorry, I digressed a little bit there. But a lot, aside from a couple of, quotes and stuff like that, like there was nothing about this soundtrack that I wanted people to listen to and say, like, I think this person is making fun of this era, or anything like that. Like I did as much research as I could because I respect the music and I wanted to maybe add something to the art form as opposed to just mimicking it.
Sure. Yeah.
So
I guess it's that fine line between
you can do as much work as possible, and you can easily still fail at something like that.
Sure.
But I did my best to like get that across. I think
it's like the fine line between being derivative in a respectful way, but not satirical. And it's like there's this window in there. But I definitely think.
Absolutely.
Just as an encouragement, I think you nailed it. When I listen to the Cuphead soundtrack, I sense the admiration, in the soundtrack itself. I sense that there's a sweetness and a reverence there. I don't sense that you're poking fun or it's like vapid or anything. So
yeah, and that was a genuine concern for me, anyways. That it was, and even the same. It was the same with Chad and Jared in terms of the game itself. Like they wanted to pay tribute to that era and it's not just a surface level, look what we can do, but they actually, they love the cartoons from that era. And so it was, and they love the games that Cuphead is based on as well. The Contra, anything from Treasure, So nothing about what they were doing or what we tried to do in anything, I would say, was a surface level endeavor. It was like we really wanted to add to the oeuvres, so to speak, and not just do something, poke fun at it, So
yeah.
In any case, that was my my brief diatribe on that.
That's really valuable, and it's really cool to kind of get your insight into that.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you had a really good teacher, and in the other interview that I heard with you, with the Super Marcato Bros, you said that it was just an incredible privilege to have him during that time of your life when you were writing this music. Between the between the resources, the written resources that you were diving into. And by the way, the reason I asked you about if you were an avid reader is because in my experience, creative people, especially peers of mine, younger creative people, are not. And I wonder how much more our art would be enhanced if we maybe stepped away from our DAW for a second, or stepped away from our keyboard and dove into some of that stuff, into the source material, into the psychology behind creativity, and diving into the people who have codified these principles, like all the resources that you mentioned. So I think it's inspiring. I think it's cool. It makes me wanna go buy all those on Amazon, but I'll refrain. And instead,
you could.
I totally could. But I need money for that, unfortunately.
Well, that's true. Well, the library is, I didn't actually buy too many things. I'm a library guy.
That's true.
So I got what I could from there. But I like reading because I enjoy it.
Yeah.
But I think there is a lot. I think a lot of the people that I really respect as artists, they tend to be fairly well-rounded, or it seems like that, anyways.
Yeah.
Like David Bowie is one of my absolute heroes, and he was like a reading fiend. Like his son just started in January. He followed Duncan Jones, who's also a great director, but he's doing because David Bowie had like a list of like his 100 favorite books or whatever. So every month there's now like a David Bowie reading list, starting last month actually. And his son is like posting like, okay, everyone, we're going to read this book this month, and then we'll discuss it. And it's like
really
on Twitter. It's amazing. So I've gotten into that, and but I think books is one avenue, but there's also other types of music. There's film.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of worthwhile stuff checking out there, and there's a lot of really like just easy, entertainment out there.
Sure.
I'm more interested in like watching things. Watching things I don't even necessarily watch or necessarily want to read, but like because they're like I might get something out of it that I can use elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes total sense.
I listen to tons of music that I don't necessarily enjoy, but I'm interested in where it's coming from.
What have you been listening to lately?
Well, actually, lately I've been listening to a lot of stuff that I do enjoy. But I've been kind of going back, and there's a whole bunch. I realized there was a bunch of holes in my listening routine. There was a whole bunch of Dylan albums that I wasn't familiar with. A couple Paul Simon albums, and subsequently Simon and Garfunkel albums. So I've been listening to those.
So
this year,
Paul
Bookends,
Simon and
I heard Bookends for the first time like 3 weeks ago, and it absolutely blew my mind. I was like, these guys are like so experimental, it's insane. And Simon, they have this like happy like folk duo vibe, but they don't really like they're super artistic. So that's been lately. I've been listening to a lot of South African pop music as well lately because I find it also is really interesting and quite gorgeous.
What are some South African pop artists? I'm going to write this down. That sounds really cool.
Well, I mean, like the big ones would be like Hugh Masekela, who just passed away, unfortunately. Miriam Makeba. I got a bunch of albums from the library, which are township music albums from like the apartheid era, and they're super interesting.
Wow.
I mean, if you listen to like one of the things, Graceland is one of my like desert island discs for sure, and like you listen to a lot of the stuff, and that's where Paul Simon got. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off, but you were talking about Paul Simon, but I think he's doing his farewell tour.
He is, in fact. So I was going to tell you that Paul Simon is by far my biggest influence, musically, lyrically. Simon and Garfunkel, like I know his whole catalog. I'm obsessed with him. I go through seasons where I listen to nothing but Paul Simon stuff.
He's a genius.
He is a genius, man. And
Graceland though is such like that album is just
it's perfect. I mean, I love Graceland. I mean, when it comes to the two of them, I'd say Bridge Over Troubled Water would be my favorite Simon and Garfunkel album. I know I hear exactly what you're saying about their experimental sort of kind of pushing the envelope. Have you heard the song by them, The Sun is Burning in the Sky? I think it's The Sun is Burning.
What album is it on? Or is it
It might be on Wednesday morning, 3 a.m. Let me see. The Sun.
Oh, so that one the library doesn't have, and I haven't. Or maybe they do have it, and it hasn't come in yet.
The Sun is Burning. Looks like it might be on Old Friends.
Okay.
Anyway,
compilation.
I won't spoil it for you, but listen, if you get a chance to, you can probably find it on YouTube. Well, you can definitely find it on YouTube. Check out that song and listen closely to the lyrics, and you'll see just how they were pushing the envelope super early on. And so that's a great one. But anyway, we got on a Paul Simon tangent, which is a great tangent to get on.
I just read the Paul Simon biography too, a month and a half ago, which I think was fairly I don't think he really wanted it written because it definitely portrays certain aspects of him in an unfavorable light. But he was a bit of a control freak, and that's cool.
Yeah, he was. I've heard some. Yeah. Unfortunately, I've heard some stories about him that have made me sad. Just because when you put your heroes on a pedestal.
Yeah, it's never a good idea to do that.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's shame on me.
It is an interesting book though.
Well, I'll definitely have to check that out.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, what the biggest insight or lesson that you took away from having the teacher, going through all these resources, and composing Cuphead. I mean, I take it you thought about music and thought about composing in a different way from before all this happened. Can you maybe share some lessons that you learned, some insights that you learned, some opinions that might have changed of yours?
I don't know if I really can. I mean, I think it was it ended up being pretty well what I expected it to be. And if you go to music school now and you're actually serious about getting a any point, you end up living in the school for 4 years, 6 years, 8 years kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, like, you know, when I was doing my undergrad, I was practicing 8 or 10 hours a day. And it was just, that's kind of what you did if you wanted to, like, actually, you know, succeed, I think.
Sure.
And, I think going into this, I kind of knew what the procedure was going to be, because I also know myself, and I know that I try to be fairly thorough, I think.
Right.
So I don't know if I learned, other than, like, you know, technical stuff about how to actually do it, but I didn't really learn anything about, it's literally just like preparation and working as hard as you can.
What were some of the big things that your teacher helped you in? So if you would bring a chart to him, what were kind of the big takeaways that he would contribute to throughout the whole process?
You know, we talked a lot about, voice leading he's a big proper voice leading proponent, so I learned a lot about proper voice leading.
Like 4-part harmony, like tonal harmony type stuff?
Yeah. And, you know, being conscious of the instrument's ranges and their capabilities. I wrote a few things on trombone, which most people probably wouldn't be able to play, but we also knew that we had, you know, literally Canada's best trombone player on the session, so played them. They were still difficult, but there was, you know, a lot of it is, I've been in enough sessions where I've played charts which are, you know, you can tell are poorly written, and they're not hard, but because they're organized poorly or written on the page poorly or not clear, you take an easy piece of music and you make it difficult for musicians.
Mm-hmm. And
specifically for this project, because we didn't have a lot of studio time, you know, we had, you know, at best like an hour or tune. Then we had to get each tune in. A lot of it was just showing up as prepared as possible for the recording sessions, with the charts looking as good as possible, making sure that things are correct and making sure that they are essentially playable.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big thing. Like, if you make something that sounds really hard, but then they don't play it well, then it's going to sound hard and it's going to sound bad.
Sure.
You can make something, you can take a few notes away and it's still going to be a cool line and it's still going to be impressive, but it's going to be a lot more playable.
Right.
So, I guess, you know, he definitely gave me a way, I think, of thinking about things intelligently and a bit more objectively, maybe. I'm frankly not much different now than I was 5 years ago.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Other than just, learning the specifics of. But I think that's it. You know. Also, if you are doing something on your own, or you're learning to do it for the first time, like, finding a good teacher who you work well with is completely invaluable. Like, there's no what you can spend 5 hours learning from a book they can show you in 20 minutes. You know, like they might have a way of breaking it down. So it's sure. Like, as long as they know their stuff and they can show, you know, explain it well, you're probably going to get, no matter how good of a book learner you are, having someone demonstrate something for you, I think in most people's cases, makes its way to the brain cortex much faster.
I want to ask you if you have any advice, and this can be philosophical advice, business advice, composition advice for younger composers who are trying to make something happen in this field and get gigs scoring games. Do you have any advice? And it can range, like I said, the gamut of any of those topics for younger composers.
Well, the advice, I've had a few people email me about advice, and my general rule is don't be an asshole.
That is a great rule, and it will get you so far.
I don't know if that applies as much if you're working, you know, as like a freelance composer. If you're working in any sort of group situation, or if you're, you know, a performing musician, not being a total pain to work with.
Sure.
You can have strong opinions, but you also need to be flexible.
Sure.
And it's remarkable how many people don't really know that or have yet to learn that skill. So I think that's an invaluable. Word travels fast if people don't want to work with you or if you are difficult.
That's a really good point.
So, I mean, I don't really know how to offer advice to indie composers because I didn't really go through, I think, the typical channels, and I don't even really know what those are. Like, I guess making a demo reel and shopping it out maybe is something that people do, but that's kind of foreign to me.
Sure.
There are definitely, I mean, there are definitely, it seems like now, tons of networking opportunities, particularly in the States. There's the PAX. I'm going to be at PAX East in April.
Oh, nice.
I'm speaking on a panel there, I think. But I mean, that seems like a huge. I guess that's maybe a bit more industry wide. Same with GDC. But then there's like the Audio Gang. I know them through Facebook. I guess they have their own website. But I feel if you're an independent composer working for games, joining Audio Gang seems to be like invaluable.
Mm-hmm.
Do your homework, work hard, don't be an asshole. Those are they still don't necessarily guarantee success, but
it's a good start. It's a really good start.
it's a good start, and the harder you work, the luckier you get, I think is the saying, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Something along those lines. So if no one knows you exist and you're not doing anything and you're sitting at home being like, why is nobody hiring me to write for their games? Well, there's a reason for that maybe. Like, people need to know that you're even around. For a long time, my general rule of thumb as a freelancer was, like, the issue with being a perfectionist is you're always buying gear and you're always upgrading gear and it just never ends. I just bought a xylophone like last week. Like, it's nonstop. But I think that when you start making money, it's a good rule of thumb to reinvest at least a small percentage of what you make into what got you there in the first place.
Sure.
So, like, if you get work writing for a game, then maybe like half of what you make from that, half of your fee could be into upgrading your DAW or getting a better sound sample package or something. Like, obviously you need to eat, but
right.
I think reinvesting in the reason that you're getting paid in the first place is maybe something that people overlook. You're investing in yourself,
right? Yeah,
which is important.
That's a really good way to look at it. Another skill creative people often don't have is, trying to treat it like a business. Like business skills, practical, fiscal discipline.
There are also plenty of good books, like there's Investing for Dummies and other such, financial planning books. They don't seem to teach that in school, and they should. Or I don't think a lot of schools teach even just basic making a budget and
sure.
or running a business kind of thing. Like, I will say this about if you're a freelancer, which I assume most people also writing music for games, like they're probably freelancers. Like, it's not an easy lifestyle. And it's definitely a lot of, you have to be really committed to it.
Yeah.
It's worth it, but it's not like going to the office every day and coming home and then you don't have to think about it. Like, you're always kind of like, if you're self-employed,
right?
You got a lot of plates in the air. So
is that the hardest thing you think about being a freelancer? Is just the inability to sort of leave work at work, come home at 5 and be with your family, like, or whatever?
It can be hard if you don't enjoy that. I mean, maybe that's also everyone's not necessarily cut out for that either.
Mm-hmm.
Like, which is fine. I personally enjoy it, but I'm kind of used to living that way now. Like, when I moved, I got pretty good at living below the poverty line for a couple of years too. So, you learn to be creative in that sense.
Right.
Yeah. I guess you have to be willing to, if this is not just a side job for you, and if you want to pursue this as a career, then you need to be willing to accept that risk, and you need to be, maybe, I know lots of people who give themselves deadlines. Like, they say, like, if I give myself 5 years, or if I'm not a success by the time I'm 30, then I will change careers, which is, not necessarily it's not. I don't know if that's necessarily good or bad. You know, it depends on the person. But some people, you know, it's if you're not cut out for it, that's okay. It's good to know that, though.
There's a lot of wisdom, man.
You know, that's why I actually enjoy talking to whoever wants to talk. I mean, it's probably good to talk to like a professional and get like financial advice, I guess, to a certain extent. The first year that I had a really good year, I got you know, because you don't pay taxes as a freelancer. It doesn't come off every one of your checks necessarily.
Right.
Like,
you got to set it aside.
A big chunk once a year. And like, I didn't really set much aside because I was like, how much could it possibly be? And it was,
yeah. You got dinged.
Way more than I had saved. Yeah. And I know a lot of people who have been in that same situation where like the first year that they do well, they're like, oh, this is great. And then they're like, oh,
yep,
I can't actually afford to pay this. So,
yeah.
So, I mean, once you start doing well, you're not necessarily, you know, be smart about don't waste money. Actually, you know, I will say that I will push my vegetarianism a bit. It's a lot cheaper to be a vegetarian.
Oh, you're a vegetarian?
I am. But it's not for financial reasons, really. But it does actually, aside from all of the other benefits, not to be too preachy about it, but
no, not at all.
It is, you know, if you're rice and beans, you can survive on that, and it's dirt cheap.
That's a really good point. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So I think the moral of the story is, you know, if Kris Maddigan can live below the poverty line, we don't have any excuses. You know, if we want to be a composer, we can hustle, eat beans and rice, and make it happen. Practice fiscal discipline. Yeah,
it's not like awesome, but
I mean, if you love it enough, you know, if
but again, if that had been, you know, more than a few years, if they had reached some sort of like, if I do this for more than 5 years, I'm going to change careers. Like, you can't do that your entire life necessarily either.
Sure.
Or you can, but it might not, you know, there might be a point where you just want to say like, okay, enough.
On the last interview I heard with you, you were pretty eager to get back into the classical percussion thing, playing gigs that way.
Yeah, I mean, where'd you see yourself? That's what I'm doing at the moment.
Gotcha.
I don't see anything radically different unless unless any you know, big other interesting projects come up. I don't have any other composition stuff on the go, and I'm not interested in becoming a regular composer because I'm very slow at it and it eats up a lot of time.
Right.
So, I mean, I would write if, you know, like I might have mentioned, like if they do a Cuphead 2, if that happens to occur and they want me to write music, then that's something I would love to do.
Yeah.
Or if they did a different project. I think for me to want to take on the incredible workload of any other writing projects, it would have to be a hell of an interesting project with a far off deadline.
Gotcha.
So, but at the moment, I'm just keeping myself busy, doing lots of playing and doing lots of, you know, do my own independent study.
Well,
trying to learn guitar.
Oh, nice. That's awesome.
I learned the E minor today and A minor. So
Hey,
I'm literally I'm that far. It's like page 2 of the book. So.
Way to go, man! You can play about half of a Paul Simon song. Because they're pretty simple.
Possibly.
Slip Sliding Away only has like 4 chords. So I think that should be your first goal.
I could maybe print out some temps for that tune.
Yeah, Slip Sliding Away is a great song. You bust that out
is a nice tune,
at a party. Everyone knows that song. You ever talk to someone and you just leave thinking, wow, you're really smart? I don't know how else to phrase it, but I just felt like Kris was such a fount of knowledge of all kinds. Anyway, my biggest takeaways from this interview were to take a break from the computer, social media, even from composing in our DAW, and read. One of my favorite quotes says that if you give me 6 hours to cut down a tree, I'll spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. And I think as creatives, we could benefit from a little more axe sharpening. Anyway, this has been Composer Code. I'm Matt Kenyon. Go read a book.